So Neil Levy is Professor of Philosophy at Macquarie University in Sydney. Also has a role here at the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics. Neil,
Getting myself some water.
getting himself some water. Do you want some here?
No, that's all right. Even us zombies get thirsty now. Okay. I don't need no stinking PowerPoint. So this should dovetail fairly nicely with Keith's paper. It doesn't require you to take any stand on illusionism. It doesn't even require you to take any stand on the dependency thesis, what Keith called the dependency thesis. That is, that the badness of pain depends on how it feels qualitatively. I don't know if that's true. I'm sympathetic to the illusionist view. But the question I want to ask is, how and how much does phenomenal consciousness matter morally, assuming that's true, and indeed assuming it's not true? I think lots of philosophers think that it matters a great deal. In fact, I think it's a widespread view in philosophy that it's the most important thing in the world. Or, not quite equivalently, that it's the ground of there being important things in the world. It's only because we're phenomenally conscious that there is importance in the world, something that wouldn't have any application if we weren't phenomenally conscious. That's the question I'm interested in. There are lots of different kinds of values you could distinguish here. And I'm only interested in two kinds. Following the literature, this is a paper shaped by, so as I say, lots of philosophers believe this, but not many really argue for it. I'm considering particularly Charles Seward and Uriah Kriegel, who both explicitly argue for this, but others as well. So following their lead, I'm focusing on two aspects of value. One is what I'm going to call prudential value. It's the value of my life to me. So lots of organisms, every organism could be said to have a well-being. And for that matter, artifacts might be said to have a well-being. So you could say of a tree, you know, it's flourishing, it's dying, things are going well for it, things are going badly for it. But the claim is, since it's not phenomenally conscious, one assumes, that life doesn't go well or badly for it. It's a judgment you can apply, but it's not a judgment that matters to it. There's no sense in which the tree dying, means its subjective well-being is diminishing. And the other kind of value I'm concerned with is a kind of moral value. So you've got to do work to work with these people. They're not very clear, I'm afraid. But as I read them, they think that it's quite plausible that all kinds of organisms, and maybe even artifacts, have moral value. But they don't have this distinctive kind of moral value. All right. And I'm interested in these things because, or at least in part, I think they're intrinsically interesting, because it just seems to me like I have less of this phenomenal consciousness than most. So I've got the user illusion, if it's an illusion, or maybe I'm experiencing genuine phenomenal properties. But it seems to me that they're more recessive, fleeting, and just, maybe more impoverished than most people have. So I was talking to Olivia earlier about a mutual friend, Tim Bain. I used to work with Tim, write papers with him. And one of the last papers we wrote is on phenomenology of agency. And it's a very good paper. And it's a very good paper because Tim wrote 98% of it. I stopped working with Tim then, just because he was very interested in phenomenology. I don't know, what's this phenomenology business? I'm not sure I have any of that. I mean, yeah, I do, but it's trying to make, anything systematic out of it. I just don't have enough of it. So I read philosophers who go on about phenomenal consciousness, and they have examples and how important it is. And I usually share their sense of this is nice, this is not nice, pain's not nice, and fine food is nice. But when I think about that experience, it doesn't seem to be in virtue of its phenomenal properties that it's particularly nice. I mean, it has phenomenal properties, but it doesn't seem to do all that much work. So all of this makes this a deeply personal paper for me, a deeply personal issue. Does this mean I don't have much in the way of subjective well-being? Does this mean I don't matter morally? That would be a bad result. Well, maybe it wouldn't. All right. Why think that phenomenal consciousness matters prudentially for our well-being? This is one of those points in philosophy of consciousness. There are a number where people don't have an argument to offer, they have an intuition. So all I can do is to point to the intuition and using the framework that the people who've banged on about it most have used. And that's a thought experiment. I'm not sure that thought experiments are a good way to get at the truth, but yeah, we have it. The thought experiment originally developed by Charles Seward, still at it, 35 years later, still working on that same thought experiment, still elaborating it. Uriah Kriegel's written about it quite extensively recently. Very similar ends. And he calls it the phenomenalectomy, removal of phenomenal properties. So we're all familiar with zombies from Chalmers. Philosophical zombies are beings just like us, and maybe exactly like me, depending how close I am to being a zombie. But they don't have any phenomenal properties. I don't think I'm a zombie. I'm just sort of on that continuum. So they laugh at jokes, they go to papers, they eat dinner, they fall in love, they write books, they go skiing, whatever it might be. They think, they act, in some sense, they feel. But in that metaphor, which I think is a very misleading one, all is dark within. There are no phenomenal properties. Lots of stuff going on, but no phenomenal properties. So this is what the phenomenalectomy turns on. Here's the thought experiment. God comes to you, William God at this point, and says, hey, I've got a great deal for you. What do you want? I'm going to give it to you. Whatever you want. You know, think big here. Don't think small. You want to win the lottery? That's small stuff. Think big. You want to win the Nobel Prize for literature. You know, be the first philosopher to be awarded a Nobel Prize for literature since Sartre. Turned it down actually, 63, 64, whenever it was. I can do that for you. You want to do it through your own hard work? Fine, I'll just boost your brain power sufficiently so if you sit down and work hard at it, you're going to win that Nobel Prize for literature for your book. Consciousness Explained. No, really this time. But, you know, as I said, think big. What else do you want? You want the Best Actor Academy Award? Done. I'm going to, you know, boost your acting ability so casting directors can't turn you down and you just be brilliant. And Academy Award is yours. You want immortality? I can do that. That's easy. I'm God. One catch. I'm going to remove your phenomenal consciousness forever if you take this deal. Seward and Kriegel say this is a really bad deal. They would reject it, and I think any reflective being who understands the thought experiment properly would reject the deal. And they would see that a life of achievement, all this wonderful achievement, whatever you want, doesn't have to be a hedonistic life in the everyday sense of hedonistic. It could be a life of devotion and work and sacrifice and production of magnificent works of arts and philosophy and science, would be absolutely valueless for the person themselves if they didn't experience it phenomenally. Kriegel says he'd be indifferent between this offer and another one. God comes to him and says, hey, Uriah, you want to achieve all these things? Well, actually, you can't, sorry. But what I can do for you is I can kill you. God can do that. And then I'll create a duplicate of you, and that duplicate will do all these wonderful things. You know, Kriegel says, what's that to me, that a duplicate of me does all these wonderful things? I'm dead. So for me, for my subjective well-being, it has no value whatsoever. I'm dead. And equally, if I lose my phenomenal consciousness, I may not be dead, depends on your theory of personal identity, but I no longer have a subjective well-being. Things no longer matter for me. This is an intuition, as I say. There's no argument here. You're supposed to be able to see it. Okay, that's prudential well-being. The other aspect I'm concentrating on is a certain kind of moral value, a certain kind. So as I said, these philosophers accept that non-conscious things can have moral value. Again, you've got to do some work to get what it is they're trying to get to. But what I think that the view, I think this is a fair way of characterizing their view. Suppose consequentialism is true to begin with. In that case, lots of things could be said to be of value, such that they are bearers of value. Them doing well increases the amount of value in the world, whatever property we want to maximize, preference satisfaction, welfare, whatever it might be, happiness. But if consequentialism is true, at least on an unsophisticated version of consequentialism, we're just trying to maximize that amount, and we don't care about how it's distributed. In particular, we don't care whose value it is and what we do to increase it. So if it's the case that killing me increases the amount of well-being in the world, happiness, maybe I'm just a really annoying person, then we should do it, right? And if it's the case that wiping out a whole species increases the amount of well-being in the world, we should do it. We're just trying to increase whatever that quantum is that we think is valuable. Now, that's not the way the world is, according to these philosophers. Instead, people have rights, and rights are constraints on what can be done. Again, make increasing welfare or preference satisfaction is a good thing, but because people have rights, there are constraints about how you do this. You can't, for example, kill a rights bearer. You can't trade off their well-being for the well-being of somebody else. You know, famous thought experiment due to Nozick with transplant case. If consequentialism is true, somebody goes into the doctor, they're perfectly fine, doctor checks them out, but they realize that their organs are perfect matches to 5 people who are dying. If consequentialism is true, they can kill that person, should kill that person, and transplant their organs into the 5 people. They've saved 5 at the loss of 1. No-brainer. But they can't do that because that person has a right. And you can't a right to life, and you can't trade off their life for the well-being of other people. It prevents you from doing things. And these philosophers argue, Seward, Kriegel, also Diane O'Leary is the third one, that phenomenally conscious beings have rights because they're phenomenally conscious. Here's the argument. There is an argument. Each of us has a stream of phenomenal consciousness, which is ours. It's inherently or intrinsically subjective. And because it's ours, it's irreplaceable. Your stream of phenomenal consciousness can't substitute for mine. This irreplaceability entails that we're not mere containers of value, but we're separate persons with rights. That's the argument. All right, so that's prudential well-being and this special kind of very important moral value which protects you against having your rights traded away, gives you rights. How do you've got to, situate all this in an explanatory framework. And that's the work that people like Kriegel actually try to do. They say this is really hard to do because you have to somehow coordinate all of this with another intuition, which is the experience machine intuition, Another thought experiment. Experience machine in thought experiment is the idea of time, just you don't need God, just a very advanced scientist comes to you and says, it's not like the phenylectomy, but I'm not going to give you these things. You're not actually going to achieve them, but I can make it seem to you as though these things are happening. I can plug you into a really sophisticated virtual reality setup, such that you seem to live in this wonderful world in which you win the Nobel Prize, and you can't have an immortality, but you slow down your time perception so you seem to live for centuries, and you win that Best Actor Academy Award, and so forth. But none of it would be real, but it would seem just absolutely wonderful. Now, most people who've thought about that thought experiment think that that's life is very little and perhaps zero prudential well-being. And as Kriegel says, this is a mystery. How do you reconcile these two things? Because in the experience machine, you have all the phenomenal consciousness you could possibly want. It's, we're quite familiar with things being individually necessary, but insufficient, jointly necessary, of course, for something being satisfied. But as Kriegel said, it's a real mystery how it's done. Just think of it as an arithmetic problem. How do you add something that's worth zero, the phenylectomy, plus the experience machine life, which is worth zero, and get something that's worth a lot? You need to explain how this happens. Kriegel's preferred account is, well, actually, achievement without phenomenal consciousness is valuable, and it's valuable for the person whose achievement it is, but somehow that value is locked up until they're conscious phenomenon, unless they're conscious. And that consciousness, that phenomenal consciousness, unlocks the value. And he said, yeah, that's a really mysterious theory. I agree. But we've got to accept a really mysterious theory, because we can't reject the phenylectomy intuition. That's just non-negotiable. And we can't reject the experience machine intuition, because that's not negotiable. I find these intuitions highly negotiable. So I'm not at all moved by that. But I'm not going to press on that. I want to look at another problem, which none of them mention. Josh Shepard, in his book on significance of consciousness, I forget what it's called now, comes close to recognizing this problem. He doesn't quite recognize it in its most pressing form either. As a moral problem, I think it's a much more serious problem. In common with, I think, most philosophers these days, or plurality of philosophers, any case, I think that non-human animals are given far too little weight in our moral thinking as a society. I think we accord far more significance to non-human philosophers. Sorry, animals, as well as non-human philosophers, even zombie philosophers, than we do. But I also think we're in trouble if we can't trade off human welfare for non-human animal welfare. So, for example, I think were we to have to choose between 20 mice and 100 humans, we should choose the 100 humans every time. And we really make trade-offs like that all the time. We put poison down to protect bread. We build housing for people, knowing we're displacing them, thereby killing mice, and even directly killing them. But if the Seawet, Kriegel, Uehiro view is right, that's impermissible. Mice have rights because they're phenomenally conscious. So we cannot make these trade-offs. Nozick says you can make trade-offs if you accept rights. You can trade off, you can weigh consequences more heavily than rights if you are facing genuine moral horror. But anything short, you can't do it. 1,000 mice versus 1 human, obvious. 1,000 humans versus 1 mouse. 1 mouse. Sorry, you still can't save the humans. Not at the cost of the mouse. It's, genuine moral horror, we're talking billions before we can start to make such trade-offs. I think that's something we're going to find very hard to accept. What can we do? to avoid having to accept that. I mean, maybe we should accept it, but life would be very different to what it is. One thing we might do is to reject this. They seem to be thinking of an all or nothing view. You're phenomenally conscious, you're not phenomenally conscious, you have rights, you don't have rights. Another possibility is to think, well, there's some threshold of phenomenal consciousness such that above that threshold you have rights. Or even to reject the entire rights picture and say, well, perhaps your moral status, the degree to which you're protected against trade-offs, is a function of how phenomenally conscious you are. Maybe that would be bad for me because I don't know where I'm going to, possibly below the mice. But maybe you're all above the mice, so you can look at that. Maybe, but as Keith said, we have no empirical tests for this, and some reason to think that at least some animals are going to do better than us on these tests. Just think about the extra senses that some animals have. Sonar, electroception, the capacity to detect the magnetic field. This mantis shrimp, the relatively primitive mantis shrimp, well, some species of mantis shrimp, the range of species, has between 12 and 16 photoreceptors. We have paltry 3. Some mantis shrimps have the capacity to modulate their photoreceptors, their long wave photoreceptors to the local environment. What's that like? They must have such a rich phenomenal experience. It may well be they're doing better than us on this kind of metric. As I said, John Shepherd doesn't quite recognize this problem. He has he worries that his view is going to give differences between humans, and he has a solution to that. I don't think his solution actually works. And even if it did, his solution depends on us being unable to make comparisons. He just says richness of phenomenal experience is incommensurable across people. Maybe that's right. I don't think it is, but or at least I don't think there's a good reason to think it is. But even if it is right, it just lands us right back into the problem, because not being able to make the comparisons is just the problem here. It's not the solution to the problem. I think it's far more attractive to think things other than phenomenal consciousness play a really big role in these kinds of values, prudential value and moral significance. But if you start thinking that they start playing a big role, then you start wondering, how far can you push it? Is phenomenal consciousness all that important? Maybe it's playing a pretty small role. I mean, you could have a view like the Singer-Tooley view. This isn't quite their view, but it's not far from it to think that phenomenal consciousness matters because pain hurts. Therefore, any phenomenally conscious being, you have a strong reason not to cause them pain. Mice, humans, don't do it if you can possibly avoid it. But humans tend to have sophisticated cognitive capacities, roughly the capacity for mental time travel, such that it's wrong to kill us in a way it's not wrong to kill a mouse, because it probably doesn't have mental time travel. And even if it does, it's certainly less developed in mice than it is in us, such that they don't have plans and projects across time. They're frustrated by it. All right, I'm not going to develop that any further. I have written about that. What I want to do in the final how many
7 minutes.
Final 7 minutes is to more directly address the Seward, Kriegel, Uehiro view, and also to reply to objections they've made to my view. So first thing to note is every appeal they make to phenomenal consciousness is absolutely question begging. So this irreplaceability argument is question begging. Yes, I have a stream, even I have a stream of phenomenal consciousness such that it's mine and not yours. I also have an access consciousness that's mine and not yours. I have a hat that's mine and not yours. I think I have special rights in virtue of that. It's just completely question begging. There's nothing special about phenomenal consciousness here. They appeal, all three of them appeal to privacy. They say phenomenal consciousness is private, And because it's private, I'm owed respect. Don't you see the argument there? But let's say it's right. In what sense is phenomenal consciousness private and access consciousness isn't? None I can see. Keith said, even Keith, he's got even less hair than me. I can't actually see what thoughts he's having. They might be thinking phenomenal consciousness is intrinsically private. Why? Well, because we don't understand its neural basis. We don't understand. We don't even know what it would be like to understand its neural basis. We don't know how it could emerge from it. And therefore, it's intrinsically private. That's just a mistake. To make the contents of states public, you don't need to know how they're realized. You only have to know the correlations. That's all it takes. If you can, in fact, see the content of people's thoughts pretty well in scanners. Under certain conditions, you constrain the conditions pretty well. You can tell what people are thinking about. There's no reason in principle why you can't tell what they're feeling too. You don't need to understand how those feelings arise from matter. You just have to be able to see the patterns of brain activation. They see what appeals to endorsement. He says we take responsibility for our thoughts by endorsing them phenomenally. Endorsement is just a functional notion. It looks like something an access consciousness, a role access consciousness can play. Anything can. Kahan and Sevalescu of this parish say being phenomenally conscious gives you a point of view. That's a mistake. That's a functional notion in favor of everyone. Access consciousness is designed to underwrite a point of view. All right. Now let me, in conclusion, just talk about Seward's response to me. He says that, I'm just wrong in thinking that a zombie, I talk about zombies, not just semi-zombies like myself, can have their desires satisfied. And you can expand this thought to not just his desire satisfaction theories, but also objectivist theories and obviously hedonistic theories. And that's the reason why they can't have their desires satisfied, he says. It's because when I think about my desires, Charles Seward, I've realized I don't want it to be the case that I win the Nobel Prize for philosophy. Nobel Prize for literature for my work in philosophy. But I want it to be the case that I win. He doesn't have subtle, vaunting ambitions, whatever the content of that desire might be. He wants it to be the case that that desire is satisfied and that it feels a certain way to him. And he can't have that if he's a zombie. Well, first response, that's sad that zombie Seward can't have that. But, I'd like to score the winning goal in the cup final at Wembley, and I'm not going to do that. That's sad for me, but I don't think, well, there's some desire such that I'm not going to satisfy it. It means I don't have a prudential well-being. That's life. We have lots of desires we're never going to satisfy. I take it he must mean something more. He must mean our desires are normally or necessarily accompanied by a desire, that the satisfaction of the desire feel a certain way. How does he know that? He says he knows a lot of things by introspection. A lot of things he claims to know by introspection just aren't true. He claims to know by introspection that because he's phenomenally conscious, and it is in virtue of his phenomenal consciousness, that he's able to recognize objects as the objects they are. Well, lots of cognitive science tells you you don't need any sense of kind of consciousness to recognize objects as the objects they are. But suppose we do want our satisfaction of our desires to be accompanied by a certain feeling. Need it be a phenomenally conscious feeling? I said very early on that in some sense zombies are feeling beings. What's that sense? Well, there's evidence that there are feelings associated with really important items on objectivist theories like friendship, intimate relations. Relations with intimates. I'm not necessarily sex, but that too. But that these feelings are not phenomenally conscious. So think about the relationship between Capgras delusion on the one hand and prosopagnosia on the other. Capgras delusion, monothematic delusion after traumatic brain injury. the person's recognitional capacities are intact, but they've lost the feeling of familiarity associated with the person. That looks like Roger Crisp. It looks just like Roger Crisp. It does feel like Roger Crisp. It's a Roger Crisp replicant, something creepy, something weird associated with it. Hence the delusion. That's a common, it's not uncontested, but this two-factor theory of delusions is a dominant view. Prosopagnosia is the obverse. Prosopagnosia is no delusion. Lots of people have prosopagnosia. Lots of normally functioning people. They just have a deficit in this one area. It's face blindness, often called. In that case, the recognitional capacities are absent, but the feeling of familiarity is preserved. Here's the thing. Prosopagnosics are unable to use that feeling of familiarity as a way of recognizing that this person is familiar. And that suggests that this feeling of familiarity is not phenomenally conscious. It's not conscious in any sense. It's a feeling that we have, at the level of cognitive processing, but it's not one that's accessible to us. This very important experience as part of our lives, being with friends and intimate partners and so forth, is accompanied by feelings, but it's not a phenomenally conscious feeling. So that suggests that maybe the qualia is playing a less significant role than we think, even if it is in fact playing an important role. So maybe, a significant role. Maybe phenomenal consciousness matters morally. Maybe it matters for the badness of pain. Although, pain is asymbolia, gives you some reason to think maybe even pain that doesn't depend for its badness on how it feels, because people with pain is symbolia say, well, it feels just the same, but I don't mind it now. But maybe phenomenal consciousness matters. But all this other stuff, access consciousness and other aspects of cognitive processing, seem to do a huge amount of work, and they don't land us in the terrible problem that phenomenal consciousness lands us in, making phenomenal consciousness play this exalted role. So I think that's some good news for me. Maybe I don't have such a significantly reduced moral status compared to you. Thank you.